we see states where if you have a misdemeanor level assault, well, it's elevated when it's against certain groups of people, elderly, disabled. And so an assault, which would normally be a misdemeanor assault, if you have that on an elderly person, could that potentially be a felony? And then are you using self-defense or deadly force in response to a forcible felony? So in those states, there's a little bit of algebra.
We are the Armed Attorneys. Today we are talking about self-defense if you are elderly. We're going to talk about what that term generally means in the law, what it means for your self-defense rights, and what happens if we have some elderly on elderly crime going on. But before we get started, show your support for the Second Amendment by hitting the like button.
And I'll start by breaking the bad news. What is considered elderly? Life expectancy has been getting longer and longer. We were just talking about that with Edwin.
Yeah. Try telling my mother that she's elderly. She would be furious to hear that. And yet, legally, she is.
Yeah, so we'll start looking at when can you draw a Social Security check? What do states classify as a senior citizen or an elderly person? Most states it's 65 as far as I can tell.
Generally 65. I will say that I have 3 clients right now. 3 in court charged with crimes in their 80s. All 3 of them just rocking and rolling.
Yeah.
Not a day over 60, any of them, it seems, in their actions. So, life expectancies. Also, I think I'm something of an expert now in self-defense while elderly. So here we are.
Yeah, but this question comes up so frequently, I thought it'd be fun to talk about. Do you have extra self-defense rights if you're elderly?
Well, yes and no, I suppose. You very rarely see something written into code that says if you are over a certain age, you get to do more stuff. And there is something written into code, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's actually not how you get to act. So if you are, though, in fact, elderly, you do get a little bit of extra consideration, not based on what's written in your state's law, but based upon your reasonableness analysis. And remember that if you are using self-defense, 99% of the time, there is going to be some kind of reasonableness analysis as to your actions. Did you act in the same way as an ordinary and prudent man would have acted? Were you reasonable? And who you are has as much to do with that as what happened to you, how many guys, day or night, who had weapons, but things like your age, your gender, any disability, that plays in, right?
Yeah. And I'll say, so the kind of the factors Emily listed off are objective reasonableness factors, times of day, distances, shots fired, presence of weapons, number of actors. When we look at an age of parties, that's an objective fact. But when you start looking at, all right, there's a check on objective reasonableness, subjective reasonableness. What is held in the mind of the actor at the time that they're forced to use, deadly force potentially? And a lot of folks I would say there's a little bit of more leeway if you're elderly. Now, where does that leeway come into play? Well, maybe it's an expert testifying about action reaction time. Maybe you have some specialized knowledge about your personal physical condition. Maybe you know that, hey, you can't withstand a certain type of attack. So all of these things kind of come into play.
And it could be as simple as you are arguing to your jury, and just by common sense, your lawyer's going to get up there and be like, look at my client. Look at his attacker. He could not have done anything short of leveling the playing field with that firearm that was going to save his own life. Just the sort of gut check with the jury is maybe all it comes down to, depending on the facts.
Yeah, and then we do have a handful of states where it's kind of baked into their law. It's not express, but it is kind of baked into the law. And we'll show you the napkin math of how we get there, where maybe you actually possibly have extra self-defense rights. And where this situation lives is in states where maybe you have self-defense rights or even presumptions of reasonableness rights in defense of forcible felonies. Now, what is a forcible felony? Typically, it's a felony where there's a threat of force or there is actually force or deadly force. Now, how does this get elderly folks looped into it? Well, we see states where if you have a misdemeanor level assault, well, it's elevated when it's against certain groups of people, elderly, disabled. And so an assault, which would normally be a misdemeanor assault, if you have that on an elderly person, could that potentially be a felony? And then are you using self-defense or deadly force in response to a forcible felony? So in those states, there's a little bit of algebra.
There is, although bear in mind, there will still be a reasonableness analysis. So although this turned out well for him, recall popcorn shooter,
Yeah,
movie
out of
theater
Florida.
shooter in Florida. Don't remember his name now, just remember the facts, in which that was part of the calculus, right? Was that a forcible felony on an elderly person?
Yep.
And ultimately, I mean, I looked at the video and the facts of that case and I said, he's going to prison, but the lawyers did a great job. They got the right jury and he was acquitted. But yes, when it is baked into the law that way, and you really have to look at several different facets and put them all together to get there. Bear in mind that there is still going to be a reasonableness analysis applied. Here in Texas, we have that same sort of law, right? We've got if you are a child, if you're over the age of 65, if you are pregnant,
Yep.
which Richard knows that every time I'm pregnant, I walk around the office and I'm like, touch me, it's a felony, and
That's
you know,
true.
get away with murder. It's true. But that is different, right? We have people who are, you know, residents of the state of Texas call in all the time and say, well, I know I get extra rights because I'm elderly. And I know it's in the law. And it's like, ooh, no, your guy gets extra punishment, but you don't necessarily get extra rights absent this reasonableness analysis we're talking about.
Yeah, and so I guess that's a good homework assignment. Does your state have a use of deadly force in response to a forcible felony statute? Do you have this kind of elevated, hey, this is a felony if it's an assault against an elderly? You know, if you check both of those boxes, then maybe
You
that
get some extra
situation
rights.
applies to you. But
Yeah.
the next scenario that I think gets a lot of folks in trouble is the elderly on elderly.
Yeah, I got to talk about this one. All right, y'all. So I have a case from years ago. Years ago. It is, in fact, the only one I have ever lost at trial. And my client was in his 70s. And he shot someone and killed him, you know, shot him once in the guts. And it was over like a possible like slap to the face. Not great facts, but what was a generally good fact is that my client was in his 70s. And it appeared to us that, oh, well, perhaps the victim, you know, I'm just looking at, you know, photos on an autopsy table. Maybe he's a little bit younger. No, in fact, he was born within 1 year of my client.
It's pretty wild. I mean, one had dark black hair.
Well, it was surely it was dyed.
Yes, but fairly muscular. Couldn't really tell. And then our person looked like, I don't know,
Yeah.
somebody on the box of I don't know, ginger snaps or something. I mean, they look night and day.
They did. But we argued all day long to the jury, look, this guy was in so much better shape, you know, and don't treat it as two elderly men, you know, because they are so vastly different. And the jury did not buy it. They were like, these were two old men. They did not like it. I mean, it was tough.
Yeah, that was one takeaway I got from that trial. The other takeaway was the use of deadly force in response to somebody who doesn't have a weapon. That was the other big takeaway. Juries don't care for that. They really, I think that's, I would say, more influential on their decision. They really didn't like that.
They also, takeaway 3, don't hiss at the prosecutor when she's cross-examining you.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Was not a good look.
Oof.
So, and I think, you know, along with this sort of idea that it all generally has to be reasonable, bear in mind, if you are that elderly person who is in ridiculously good shape, you are not going to get the benefit as much of that reasonableness calculation with the jury. I mean, if you have lived a really hard 75 years and you have lots of disability, yes, sure, jury is going to consider that very strongly. If you are like, I hate to give this calculation, but like we have 2 presidents that we could look at, one of which far more feeble than the other, right? Like, if you are a Donald Trump at, well, how old is he? Almost
I think he's 78. Yeah.
That 78-year-old, like, pretty spry, right?
Sure.
So you need to bear in mind that if you are that very, very healthy, fit, 78-year-old, you are not going to get as much benefit as the guy who is less healthy.
Yeah, and on the flip side, you know, it is absolutely a factor juries consider, you know, mobility. You know, in a state, most states do not have a legal duty imposed on a person to retreat. It definitely goes in your capacity to retreat. Is there a reasonable, safe alternative? Hey, maybe if you're elderly, you're not as mobile, and that's less of an option, and that factor weighs more in your favor. You know, when we look at proportionality, how much force is on one side of the equation versus the other? Well, healthy young 30-year-old, elderly person, that's that other factor that we're talking about. These things absolutely weigh in a person's favor.
Oh, yeah, absolutely they do.
But there's a lot of considerations going on here, but we hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and help us fight the anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video.
And as always, question, comment for us below. Until next time, we're the armed attorneys.